Okay. All right. So we are going to begin the Sufficiency webinar. And Jay, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jackie. And I saw several familiar faces out there, so it's really great to connect with you. I just want to preface this by saying that I'm actually starting sabbatical this month, so give me a cheer and wish me good luck. One of the things that I want to do is to actually finish the work I started some time ago on the concept of sufficiency, the idea that justice, both socially and globally, somehow demands enough for all. I think this is the slogan of sufficiency that makes sense of it for social and global justice. And basically, this corresponds within the capability approach to the idea that no one should fall below a certain threshold, or in other words, if people do, when people do fall below that threshold, then a society that does little or not enough to raise people above that threshold is lacking in justice. And so too, the world globally is unjust to the extent that we do not raise everybody to some kind of threshold. But I'm just, so I'm going to try to give you just the basics of my thinking. This is at variance with some of the common thinking in the literature. It's in some way corresponds to the thinking of Martha Nussbaum, but I think I'm also a little bit at variance with her. So my struggle is to both give you, what other people say and what I say. And I must say, I'm being an egoist here. I'm erring on the side of telling you what I'm thinking, because I'm hoping that our interaction and your feedback will help me to develop this over the coming year. So here's my agenda for today. I want to simply begin by refreshing everyone's memories of the basic ideas of Nussbaum's capability approach to justice, and with a focus on this idea that each person should have sufficient capabilities for a life of human dignity. You've seen that sentence, that phrase in many places in what Nussbaum has written. So we're going to focus on three things. One is, the first one is a common assumption of hers that I don't need to stress, that it refers to each person, so no individual is neglected. The thing we're going to focus on a lot is, well, what does it mean to have sufficient capabilities? And I want to say that I really respect the people who are doing important measurement work with capabilities. But what I have to say today is going to be much more conceptual. I think we need to get at, well, conceptually speaking, what are we talking about? What do we mean when we talk about having sufficient capabilities? So we need some kind of conceptual anchor point from which to start measurement discussion. And then, of course, how does this relate to the idea or ideas of human dignity? So those are the foci of what I have to say today. And I'm going to talk, since I'm a philosopher, I want to talk about how these questions are embedded in philosophical problems. My thought is that there's actually a paradox in the way that Martha presents this. And I'm suggesting that in order to resolve that paradox, it leads us to some new or different capability concepts, and actually a better understanding of what it means to call for enough for all. And I think you'll find it also gives an interesting linkage between the idea of social justice and global justice, which you don't often see. Often these things are opposed, but I think they actually, when you look at things in the way I'm going to present, they actually have to be interlinked. Okay, so first of all, what everyone knows already, basics of capability, Nussbaum's capability thinking, and mine. When we talk about people's capabilities, what we want to know is what they can actually manage to do and to be, how they can actually manage to function, Not all capabilities are valuable. Sen gives this lovely example of the capability to use your favorite dish detergent. Well, it may be something that you value, but it's not something that we can claim is valuable for everyone. Nussbaum has the example of the capability to whistle Yankee Doodle Dandy while standing on your head. Same kind of thing. So let's review what does make capabilities valuable for everyone. And I think there are two considerations here. One is that these are things that we have reason to value as part of a good life. All right, so there's the scope of pertaining to one's life as a whole and whether one's life is satisfactory or complete. And the other thing is that these things should apply to anyone. So what we're looking for are the capabilities that anyone has reason to value as elements of their good life. So we have to abstract. You know, some people like to eat rye bread, other people prefer to eat chapatis, but what we need to do is to abstract from those realizations and talk about what we all have reason to value in terms of eating well. What is eating well? Now, in saying this, I want to respond to one of the questions that some of you raised in in registering for this webinar. There were questions about, well, how do we have transnational standards, and what's the relation of local standards to transnational standards? Well, you know, that's a very complex question. What I'm giving you here is just one little piece of the logic, that what we're doing to be able to have a transnational conversation is we have to abstract from the particular, oh, what's going on here?
Sorry, Jay. I think you're back. Oh.
I think I'm back. Is this okay? We're still on the slide called Basics.
I just made a big error. We're back? Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay. So, I mean, the way we can actually try to have some transnational understanding of what's enough is by abstracting from these particulars. Like, we're not just talking about what's enough rye bread or what are enough chapatis, but we're talking about broader standards about what it is to eat well. At the same time, someone had a question about indigenous peoples. And in this case, I think we have to realize that the realizations have a distinctive importance, right? That we can generalize about a capability to live in harmony with nature. But if you're a Cree or an Algonquin or a member of another indigenous group in another part of the world, what that means for you is something very particular, and we can't just erase the particularity of that in calling for everyone to realize sufficient capabilities. Well, okay. Nussbaum, of course, has her list. So when we talk about having enough for all, when we talk about having sufficiency and justice demanding that, we're talking about enough of these. And I'm not going to talk about these in detail. The idea is rather to focus on what do we mean by sufficiency? What does it mean to set some kind of threshold? What does it mean to have enough? And I'm going to make some very, I'm going to make some very, I'm going to put this in the context of philosophical, no, I'm not. I'm going to race ahead. No, I can't do that. I have to go back to this. So the philosophical problem is that sufficiency is often seen as an alternative to some further kind of equality. In fact, Martha herself says, well, we can't know at this point what equal capabilities would mean and whether to what degree equal capabilities are realizable. So we should confine ourselves to talking about putting everyone over a threshold that is sufficient for a life of dignity. Indeed, if you think about it, I mean, consider two political parties. One is calling for enough for all, and another is calling for equality. Well, the one that's calling for equality has a higher burden of justification. It's a lot more difficult to justify to your other people in your political society some kind of equality, whereas the idea of enough for all seems to go over a lot more easily, and it's a lot more. There are a lot more reasons you can give for that, and think of what kind of opposition can anyone raise to the idea of providing enough for all. That's a very difficult idea to oppose. So there's a kind of difference, right, between when we talk about sufficiency, we're talking about it as an alternative to demanding equality. So that's an assumption to start with. Then we have to ask conceptually, well, enough for what? What are we really talking about when we talk about sufficiency? Are we talking about enough for people to be satisfied? Are we talking about enough for people to have any kind of dignity? Or are we talking about enough to meet a standard of equal human dignity, as, for example, is espoused in doctrines of human rights? Now, the problem is that when you start thinking about what this means, you face the question, is anything enough for equal dignity short of equality? So that gives you a paradox. We start off thinking about sufficiency as an alternative to equality. We try to ground this in dignity, but once we start thinking about equal human dignity, then it looks like we have to demand some kind of equality for people, and not mere efficiency as something distinct. So what I want to do at this point, there's a lot of debate about what dignity should mean. Dignity can be just a regular political concept. What Nussbaum actually says at this stage is that, look, we don't need to tell people what dignity is or what dignity requires. Every society has a concept of dignity. So what we need to do is to say, well, what in public reason in that society would people associate with a life of equal dignity? I'm going to go a little bit farther than that. She may be right, but in fact, the ideas of human dignity are quite varied, and whether they can all converge on a common understanding of sufficiency, of what's enough for a life of human dignity, I'm not too sure. Excuse me. Sorry about that. It's the trouble from doing something from home. So what I want to pull out from this is I have a particular idea of an idea of dignity that Nussbaum seems to support, and I want to dig that out from a passage that she's written, and then I want to try to show you how equal dignity can be used to argue for enough for all. In other words, I want to show you what's the conceptual and argumentative logical connection between the idea of equal dignity and the idea of enough for all. Okay, so please look at this passage. It's from Women in Human Development. And as she gives you this portrait, let's try to think about, well, where in this picture do we see dignity? Okay, so she asks us to think of a tragic character, assailed by fortune. We react to the spectacle of humanity so assailed in a way very different from the way we react to a storm blowing grains of sand in the wind. Or we see a human being as having worth, as an end, a kind of awe-inspiring something that makes it horrible to see this person beaten down by the currents of chance, and wonderful at the same time to witness the way in which chance has not completely eclipsed the humanity of the person. As Aristotle puts it, the noble shines through as having activity, goals, purposes, projects, awe-inspiringly above the mechanical workings of nature. Well, so let's start just by trying to see, well, what is, according to this passage, what is she trying to show us that is especially admirable about human beings as distinct from the mechanical workings of nature or grains of sand being blown in the wind? And what I see here as being especially valuable is the idea of striving. Right? This person who's beaten down is someone who's striving for a good life, striving to live well, striving to achieve these goods that we appreciate as parts of a good life. And I think the idea of striving is really important, right? So this means that we can even disagree with someone's particular goals. We can disagree with someone's conception of a good life, and yet we can recognize the person as striving to live well for some kind of human life. And this, I think she's saying, this is what should command our respect and our admiration and our care. And so this has the consequence that even really despicable people are in their twisted ways striving to live well. Okay, so what do we do about this? We recognize in each other this striving to live well, even though we may be critical of each other's particular goals. You know, someone may suffer from an addiction. We might say, oh, you know, they're never going to be happy that way. And yet we recognize that within them they are striving to live well, and this calls upon us to respond to them in some kind of positive way. So what do we do with it? Let's connect this then to the idea of sufficiency, of why people deserve enough. And so we start with this idea of dignity, and let's suppose that that simply means this striving to live well for human goods. So if that's what we mean by dignity, then what do we mean by equal human dignity? Well, I think we can put equal human dignity in this way, that no one's striving to live well is privileged, right? That everyone's striving to live well matters, and matters equally. And once we see that, once we think that, wow, everyone's living to well matters and matters equally, that seems like a very powerful idea for opposing a lot of inequalities. Okay, but this is the part that we still have to work out. What is the connection between this general recognition that everyone's striving to live well matters? How do we connect that up with opposing unequal capabilities? And so this is the argument that I'm going to present to you. And I think this is really at the core. It's an implicit core of capabilities thinking. It's how capabilities thinking. It's one way to show how capabilities thinking is intrinsically has an egalitarian tendency that's central to it. So let's start off with this premise that of equal human dignity, that everyone's striving to live well matters and matters equally. Remember what we mean by the valuable capabilities. These are the capabilities to function in ways that we all have reason to value. So in other words, the valuable capabilities are the capabilities to live well. Now, let's turn this around and ask a kind of negative question. Can we suppose that it's okay for some people's capabilities to be weaker than others? How could that be all right? How could that be permissible? And the thought is, well, that could only be permissible if some people's striving to live well mattered less than others. But we've just recognized that everyone's striving to live well matters equally. So that can't be. The answer has to be no. It cannot be okay for some people to have weaker capabilities than others. So, I mean, if we take equal human dignity in the way that I've suggested, it seems to give us a really powerful argument why unequal capabilities should not be permitted. Okay, so I hope, I'm not going to ask for comment now because that we'll wait for questions later. But this is, okay, this is, I think, a core argument in trying to work out a capabilities approach of what is sufficient for justice and what is sufficient for equal human dignity. But let me point out, this takes us back to our paradox, right? We started off assuming that justifying sufficiency was easier than justifying full equality, that enough meant enough for equal human dignity, and that equal human dignity demanded equal capabilities. But then the problem is that nothing short of equality is enough. We started off looking for enough and sufficiency to be something different, something easier to justify than equality, and now the difference seems to vanish. Okay, so we've got this paradox, and what do we do? I'm going to suggest that the solution to this is that we need to, first of all, relativize capability in a social context, social and historical context. So and sufficiency needs to be seen in a historical and social context. So the intuition behind this is we now think that it's not an adequate life, that sufficiency requires literacy, right? If we're going to demand enough for all, that certainly requires that everyone should be able to read and write. But when you think of it, this was not always so. If you go back to several hundred years, 500-600 years, it was possible to rule over a vast empire without being able either to read or to write, as Charlemagne proved. He was illiterate, and yet he was a great emperor, an emperor over a vast territory anyway. So what I want to do is I want to define, and this is how I'm going to deviate quite a bit from what other people say about sufficiency. I want to define sufficiency in terms of the society, and I want to define it in terms of what could be produced for everyone in a society. And I'm going to suggest that if you believe in equal human dignity, then nothing less than that can be sufficient. So here we go. Let's define the social capability as the sets of capability levels that a society can produce for its members. And let's define the social optimum capability as the highest capability levels that a society can produce for all of its members. Right? If a society were trying to equalize the capabilities of health, what are the highest health capabilities that it could achieve for all of its members? And the claim then is that nothing short of this social optimum is sufficient for equal human dignity. So this is a really radical claim, right? I mean, often the idea of sufficiency has a much more minimal connotation, especially when people think about sufficiency, about enough, in relation to basic needs. Okay? And I'm suggesting that if you follow this line of argument based on equal human dignity, it's much more demanding. So this is a very, unlike much of the usage of the term sufficiency, this I think is a very demanding conception of sufficiency. Nothing short of the social optimum is sufficient for equal human dignity. There's an argument for this. I'm not sure how interested you'll be in this argument, but you'll see how it works. Is there anything less than the social optimum that could be sufficient for equal dignity? Well, consider a possible society. Suppose it could raise everyone's capabilities to level L, but instead it allowed a certain percentage of the population to remain below. Is that permissible? Here's our core argument. Only if some people striving to live well does not matter as much, but that would be inconsistent with equal human dignity, which says that striving to live well matters equally for everyone. So the consequence is that nothing short of the social optimum is sufficient for equal human dignity. Okay, so this is the core of the thinking that I want to try to apply and develop in capability terms and thinking about social and global justice over the coming months. I want to now turn to some questions and critical questions that might be raised about this. One question that one of you raised in registering for this webinar was about how do we conceptualize poverty in high-income countries? I mean, for example, poverty, it seems we can't just measure poverty in simple terms like numbers of calories consumed. You know, we want to ask about what are the levels of health and education and so on. Well, so my answer to this is that there's not going to be a simple formula, that in each society, people are going to have to go through a particular process of critical thinking. They're going to have to think, well, what are the levels of health that our society could actually produce for everyone? And then we ask, well, why are we not doing that? And this is a line of thinking that we can use in my country, we can use in Canada, we can use, certainly it's used south of the border in the United States. It can be used throughout Europe and in the high-income countries in Asia and Latin America also, you know, like Chile and Singapore. You know, these questions can be asked. What level of health and education could the society be producing for its members? What level of capabilities could be supported for all members of the society, technically, given the technical productive capacity of the society? Why then are we not doing this, and what steps could be taken to bring it about? So that's, I think, how that's the avenue towards the line of thinking towards conceptualizing poverty in high-income countries. Another question was about, well, isn't there still any importance to income inequality, even if we take a capability framework? And I think the answer to that is yes, because as it's been shown, as Sir Michael Marmot has shown, income inequality affects social capital and health outcomes. And there's other work on this too. So income inequality may not be so good as a measure of the inequalities that matter in a country, but it certainly is an important driver of inequalities and of inequalities in capability. Bit of reflection on what's going on here. We're not defining enough or sufficiency in terms of survival. We're not defining it in terms of subsistence needs. We're not defining it in terms of subjective satisfaction. That's another approach that's been taken in the literature, namely famously by philosopher Harry Frankfurt. Rather, we're defining enough capability for each as much valuable capability as a society can produce for all. And so this has a clear consequence that what was enough in the past is no longer enough. So sufficiency gains a dynamic character that it doesn't always have in other formulations and conceptions of it. In other words, enough, sufficiency is a moving target that's defined by the social capability at the moment. Now, still, there are questions you can raise about the relationship between sufficiency defined in this way and justice. So my question is enough enough? Right? Is sufficiency, even defined in a very egalitarian way that I try to do it, is that enough to achieve to constitute social and global justice. And I think that I'm going to try to show you that no, it's not sufficient. It's only one component. It's only a necessary condition for achieving social and global justice. So one question that comes up here is this. When we think of all those who do not have enough, who should get priority? And should we give priority to the worst off, who are farthest from having enough? And this is an idea that was raised famously by Derek Parfit. And if we think about it, so it depends on how we think about who is the worst off. I think a good way to think of the worst off is to think about disaster victims, right? Rather than thinking about this abstractly in terms of how much money one person has versus another, let's think about the people who are really in bad shape, the disaster victims. So what priorities does justice require for disaster victims? And of course, the first priority is to rescue them, is to keep body and soul together. The second priority is to actually restore functioning to their communities and to restore them, to restore individuals to functioning within their communities. So for one thing, they can achieve their livelihoods. So restoration of livelihoods is also an important thing. So when you look at the worst off in a concrete way, as we do when we think about disaster victims, we can see that yes, there are different steps that should be taken to give priority to them, but those are all steps towards including them in a social interaction that provides them with enough, right? So that below the level of sufficiency, yes, there are different groups that need to be dealt with, need to be treated, need to be responded to more urgently. But it's important to see that this is not different from providing people with enough. These are the first steps towards providing these people with sufficient capabilities. So in other words, I'm thinking of sufficiency in a way that is not opposed to the idea of priorities to the worst off, but which includes it. Someone asked about internally displaced people, and people who are displaced by, disaster victims, of course, can be displaced, but people who are displaced by development, we have other considerations of justice that also enter in here. It's not sufficient that they be brought simply to a level of capability in terms of meeting basic needs or capabilities for nutrition, for health, and so on. We're talking also about the restoration of livelihoods. There's a principle of restitution that applies. They need to be compensated for the land that was taken from them. They should also be compensated for the risk and effort that they may need to invest in their own resettlement. And notice that none of these are sufficiency concepts, right? So sufficiency does not answer all of our questions about what just development would require. Another question that was asked was, what about, why should we worry about sufficiency thresholds when there's absolute poverty? And again, my answer is the same, that responding to absolute poverty is simply the first step to establishing sufficiency. Okay, I want to come to a conclusion briefly. I just want to say a couple more things that we need when we talk about what is sufficient. Someone might ask, what about future generations? Right? Can we think about what is sufficient for us in ways that may deprive future generations of enough for them? And so my thought there is that we have to define what is sufficient for us in ways that are sustainable. So when we talk about what is the social optimum, what are what are the capabilities that a society could produce for everyone, we need to be asking what are the capability levels that this society could sustainably produce for its own members now without depriving future generations of the same capabilities. And I'm going to skip over this. I think that, as Sen points out, equality is not the only consideration of justice, so is efficiency. I think that's right. So I'm just going to note that here. People can bring it up if they want to. What about agency empowerment? Do social and global justice also require them? I think the answer is certainly yes, and these may not be capability concepts. I noticed that one person who entered the question was doing work on the question of what is sufficient empowerment. And that's really interesting. I'd like to hear what you're finding, what you find is the answer to that. I think I have a lot to learn from you on that point. What about, okay, now the last question I'd like to touch on is what about global inequality? So if we define sufficiency simply in terms of what one country can produce for its people, clearly this line of thinking, it would, if it's not checked, could be used to call for or justify or tolerate global inequalities. So suppose we define global justice as providing enough for all in each country. And then what's enough in each country is the social optimum, the highest capability levels that can be produced for everyone there. Well, obviously, the social optimum in some countries is much higher than what can be produced in others. What can be produced for everyone in Canada is much greater than what could be produced for everyone in, say, Mali. Well, if that's true, and then if you follow the thinking I've been developing, it would seem to follow that I'd have to say what's considered enough in Mali is low compared to, and what's considered enough in Canada would be much, much higher, two different standards of sufficiency. And this seems to contradict the principle of equal human dignity, which says that everyone's striving to live well matters and matters equally. So I think the solution then also says that, well, okay, we start by defining sufficiency locally, but global justice also requires upward harmonization, which means reducing the gaps where there's a gap between higher and lower social capabilities, that global justice requires raising the social capabilities in countries where it's lower. So in that case, we would say that justice does provide enough, does require providing enough for all in each country, but it also requires this kind of upward harmonization of removing gaps between the higher and lower social capabilities in different countries. And I think this is actually an idea that many people subscribe to. It hasn't been articulated much in social philosophy, and so I think it's interesting. That's one thing that makes this approach interesting. And it also shows that there's a linkage between social justice and global justice, and I think that's a very interesting result also. Okay, so here are the main points. I'm sorry I haven't been able to answer all of the questions that were provided online, but I tried to respond to a few and to your interests. So please, keep your questions in mind, and so we can discuss them in the question period, which is about to begin. Here are the main points I tried to make, that according to Nussbaum, justice requires that everyone has sufficient capabilities for a life of human dignity, but the idea of human dignity and equal human dignity is actually very demanding. So my solution to this is to define sufficiency in terms of a social optimum, the highest level that a society can produce for all of its members. And the goal of social justice should be to raise everyone to this level. And the goal of global justice should be to raise every country's social capability to the highest one that's achievable. And before I forget, I want to say that I'm hoping that at least a few of you will stay in contact with me and share your ideas about sufficiency as I develop them over the coming months. And to this end, I've left my email address there, which is just my name @gmail.com. So, Jackie, shall I just exit then?
Yeah, I guess what the first thing I'd like to know is to Ms. Ahu, do you feel that your question has been answered, or do you have a follow-up, because you are the one who brought up the question of the displaced persons?
Good.
Sorry, let me unmute you. Are you there? Madam, do you have any further questions about the internally displaced persons? Any follow-up to Jay's comments? I think we might have lost her on that. Unless I hear back from her, maybe another thing that you might want to just touch on is, quite a few people had questions about the Latin American region, and considering
Yes.
high levels of inequality, one of the questions that was asked was, what would be the influence of this fact in the definition of the core capabilities threshold? If maybe you could talk a little bit about sufficiency in the context of either Latin America or just in general, where you have regions with high levels of inequality.
Right. So I want to say two things about that. One is that I think that there's a close link between our ideas of capability sufficiency and the ideas of social exclusion and social inclusion. Now, Sen has written a little bit about the concept of inclusion and exclusion, and he asks the question, well, doesn't it really matter what we're talking about including people in? And I think that's quite right. I mean, if you have a slave society, then including people in the typical mode of production, namely slave labor, is not such a good thing. So if we want to use the ideas of inclusion and exclusion in social policy, we should really clarify inclusion in what. And so I think we can link that with our ideas of sufficiency. So the kind of inclusion that matters is including people in those kinds of social activities and social relations and social interactions that allow people in that society to achieve sufficiency, to meet or rise above the thresholds of capability achievement that the society is capable of providing. So this is really, and I think this actually taps popular thinking. I think that when people ask themselves, am I getting enough in society, or am I being excluded from the good life in this society? They have an image of a level of living that the society should be able to provide for everyone, and they're making observations about whether they are able to live that well or not, or whether they're being excluded from that level of living. And I think this way of thinking makes a lot of sense. And in a way, what I'm simply trying to do is to articulate it and to show what the logic of that way of thinking is. I think that I don't know. I mean, I would just ask whether my Latin American friends, whether the ideas of exclusion and inclusion are really strong enough. If we interpret inclusion and exclusion in this way, are these ideas strong enough to talk about justice in Latin America? Okay, so that would be, I would ask them for feedback on that. And I'm going to be asking my friends in India when I go next month whether they think such ideas of inclusion and exclusion and sufficiency are strong enough, are robust enough politically in those societies. The other thing to keep in mind is that income inequality, we may say that, oh, well, that's not, capability inequality is what matters in the space of evaluation. But in the causal space, income inequality has a lot of bad consequences. And so what we're seeing now, there's this growing body of research that says that income inequality has consequences on, for example, health outcomes, which is to say that income inequality supports inequalities of health capability. So income inequality is not unimportant. But if we want to apply the idea of sufficiency directly, then one way we might do it is through the idea of inclusion and exclusion.
Great. I've unmuted Ms. Kaleha. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, but she wanted to ask you a question about economic and social rights. The differences or similarities between that and your approach. What she wrote is, economic and social rights require that states provide at least the minimum standards of economic and social rights instead of sufficiency that you've used, and that these rights be progressively implemented instead of upward harmonization as you've used. And so I'm wondering if you see your approach as different from that or not, and then Ms. Kaleha, you can sort of jump in as well. Go ahead, Jay.
Okay, thank you. So again, I would suggest that establishing minimum levels, as human rights thinking requires, is the first step. And so I think this is an illustration of how there's more to achieving justice than achieving human rights. That's not to say that human rights are unimportant. On the contrary, they're the first step. They're initial steps. This also distinguishes what I'm thinking about in terms of sufficiency from the idea of basic needs. Yeah, meeting people's basic needs is very important. And actually it relates to the idea of social inclusion and exclusion, because what the basic needs are the needs that people have in order to function within their societies. And again, just even, thinking about disaster victims, there's some priority that needs to be given to this, but we shouldn't be satisfied when that is done. That by itself is not sufficient. That's not enough. That's not sufficient for achieving social and global justice. So I'm a great supporter of human rights, and I've tried to show in other things I've written what's the logic in arguing from capabilities to human rights. And so I'm not dismissing the importance of that argumentation, but what I'm suggesting is that it's not exhaustive, right? It doesn't tell us everything we need to know about achieving social and global justice.
Ms. Kaleha, do you have any follow-up or anything else on that topic? Okay. The next question was from Annie, and let's see here. Ms. Austin, thank you. Let's see here. Wondering, how can we respond to the leveling down objection in relation to, my goodness, this thing is moving. How can we respond to the leveling down objection in relation to social capabilities? And Annie, I'm going to unmute you so you can join in as well.
Yeah. And the leveling down objection says that, well, if equality is what you value, then let's reduce everyone's capability levels to the worst off. And so that's a kind of, I think, did Harry Frankfurt use that argument? But it's a common argument anyway against equality. So here are some tentative thoughts. I'm eager to hear what you think about this. So one way I think in which Nussbaum's idea of equal human dignity stands up to that is that what we're valuing is we're affirming people's striving to live well in a way that implies that we think they ought to succeed, right? I mean, in a negative way, a philosopher could say, we're going to equally value everyone striving to live well by making it impossible for everyone to live well. And that will achieve justice, according to you. But I think, the way when Nussbaum talks about valuing human goods, she's talking about, a social value that implies their success, people's success in achieving them. A similar argument could be made at a meta level about the very idea of impartiality, right? Okay, I'll be impartial. Let's do something that ensures that everyone is messed up, that everyone is disadvantaged. But that's not the conception of impartiality that arguably ought to prevail. The kind of impartiality that we want is one that includes and embraces everyone's good and doesn't merely equalize them. So I'm looking for solutions in those directions. What do you think? Will I find any, Annie?
No. No, Annie.
Thoughts? Maybe not.
You do look connected to audio. Annie's writing. Just give her a second, and then we're going to address. We have 3 more questions in the queue. 4, actually. Okay. Annie's going to follow up with you in an email, if that's all right.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on. Daniela had a question for you. She wanted to know about considering the core concept of enough for all. How do we address food insecurity in developed countries? If you might want to talk about that. And Daniela, you should be able to speak as well.
Okay. How do we address it? Was it food insecurity or just insecurity?
Food insecurity in developed countries.
Yeah. So that would be, I think that would be an easy case. Well, of course, security is an interesting and important concept. Security applies to people both who have achieved sufficiency and who haven't, right? So if you have achieved a level of sufficiency, nutritional sufficiency, you're eating well enough. What security means is that you don't have much in the way of downside risk. Security reduces your risk of losing the capability levels that you have. So food security, in principle applies that way. But generally speaking, the people who have food security already are not at risk of losing it. The problem we have in high-income countries is that there are food deserts, that because of income insecurity, People have difficulties. They're less free to eat well and to feed themselves and their families well. So from that point of view, the same arguments for sufficiency also call for protecting those people's security, right? So we ask, well, in this country, is it not actually possible? Isn't the country producing enough to feed everyone? By producing, I mean, producing enough food, but also producing other things to import necessary food. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the argument that I've given, we ask, well, can't this country actually manage to produce enough to feed all its people? And if the answer is yes, then it's clearly an injustice that some people are insecure in their ability their freedom to maintain good nutrition for themselves and their families. So I think the standard line of thought then about social optimum leading, and if we're at a level that's below the social optimum, then we can ask questions about injustice because the country is not providing enough for all. I think that line of thinking applies really directly to the internal food insecurity that you have, that poor people face in rich countries, for sure.
Okay. Great. I'm very aware of the time, and Jay's been very gracious. He's happy to stay on and continue questions. For those of you that
Sure.
have to go because it has been an hour, I will be sending out an email with a link to the webinar as well as the slides from this webinar for you to review. But we will just keep going on with some of the questions. Let's see here. Sasikala, I apologize if I've butchered your name, had, I think, an important clarifying question. Sasikala asks, do you mean that we can talk about capabilities only with people who have met their basic needs already? Could you maybe address that? Maybe what is possibly, maybe there's some confusion between what is basic needs and meeting capabilities.
Yeah, it's okay. So meeting basic needs is an important first step to having enough in capabilities, to having sufficient capability levels. I'm struggling a little bit to understand the question.
Sasikala, can you jump in? You're not muted, so hopefully you can jump in and clarify. Hello? Sasikala?
Hello?
Yes, please.
Yes, I have heard you.
Can you, please tell me if I'm answering your question correctly. Okay. You asked, can we only talk about basic needs in relation to capability thresholds?
Yes.
And what I'm suggesting is they're different.
I want to whether those people who have not had any basic needs, or that's a shortfall in the basic needs.
Yes.
How can we measure their capabilities if we are measuring a threshold? If we are putting a threshold to it, because threshold means we are comparing people with a definite capability levels of all the people. So we are comparing the people on specific capabilities, assuming that they are having the basic needs related to those capabilities. Am I right?
Well, I think I might disagree with that. We can understand, mean, the threshold is a target. It's a goal, right? And so if people fall below that, we can measure how many people are falling below that. Basic needs may be a different goal, a different threshold.
Okay.
And I'm simply saying that, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, conceptually, basic needs are a different threshold, but it's an important one, and it's a first step towards reaching the higher threshold of adequate capability.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Benedict has a question, and he's unmuted. The general question is, do you think SEN's consequential evaluation is also a good analytical framework for this sufficiency and threshold issue in social justice? Benedict,
do I think
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Seems so. Because when I'm listening to your talk, I think you are more on talking about loose bombs, central capabilities issues, and so on. But I wonder what you think about if we just use even kind of a simple framework that is talking about those capabilities are good consequence. And that's why we need them to be the basic unit for justice and so on. That can at least that can be an approach from SEN ideas on consequentialism. So I wonder what you say about this approach.
Okay, so what I was trying to show in the last few minutes of the presentation was that justice is multidimensional, right? That simply raising everyone to the social optimum in their capability levels, that may not give us a just society. There are other requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And among them, I did want to include efficiency. So this is to say that the right social policy, the right way for a society to move is one that expands everyone's capabilities. Right? That's certainly consequentialist thinking. So what I think has to happen is that there needs to be some balancing between these different considerations. And public reason is the mechanism we have for doing this balancing, and it has to be done on a particular society kind of basis. So I don't see a rigid distinction or division between. I don't think that in seeking justice in development we should go all in as consequentialists, and we should not be all opposed to consequentialism. But consequentialism has, some important contributions to make, and they need to be weighed with all of the rest. And so what I was trying to show is really just what the idea of sufficiency, if we link it with the capability approach, what this idea can contribute as a necessary condition for moving in the direction of greater justice.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And Anne Catherine had a question that is certainly out of my expertise. Anne, are you there? Anne, are you with us? Okay. Let's see here. Oh, I think Anne is with us. Yes? I'm sorry, Anne, we can't hear you. It says here you're unmuted. Can you check the mute button? There you go.
Now? Maybe now?
You're back. Good.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I think, yeah, my question is very much not to the topic we have discussed until now, but in my research, we are focusing on energy consumption, and in energy consumption, sufficiency is one strategy to achieve a reduction in energy consumption. And we are talking about the global north. So we are analyzing basically, our country or our focus country is Switzerland. So, it's a very rich country. And so my question was with regard to, there is a concept which is the 2000 watt society, and it says that if I'm not very familiar with the topic, but as I understood it right, it says that the global or people from the global north should reduce their energy consumption to a threshold to 2000 watt, whereas people who are not who are below these threshold should increase or can increase their energy consumption per capita to 2000 watt or resource consumption. So my question was, can you relate maybe sufficiency as a concept as it is used in energy research, maybe to what your presentation pointed to?
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and I understand the idea of sufficiency is used widely in environmental discussion, and what it means there is generally, well, just enough. You know, we need to confine ourselves to consuming just what's enough and not excess. So there's a contrast implicit between sufficiency and excess. Now, there's a big difference when we talk about, sufficiency in consumption and sufficiency in capability. And this is the challenge we face environmentally, especially in climate change. How do we maintain sufficient capabilities to live well while reducing consumption? Right? So that's the challenge. So part of the answer to that is that there's a difference between talking about sufficient consumption, sufficient capability to live well. Now, a lot of consumption, I think that the distinction that Sen makes between agency freedom and well-being freedom applies here. Agency freedom means the freedom to get what you want. Okay? Well-being freedom means the freedom to live well. So the question is, for climate change and other environmental considerations, how do we preserve our freedom to live well if we have to, restrict our consumption? And so the answer is, well, we may not be able to get everything that we want. We may need to restrict agency freedom in that sense. We may not be able to satisfy all of the preferences that we once had. But the question is, can we still manage to live well or live better with those restrictions? So hopefully the idea of sufficiency, if you put it in terms of capabilities, it can still be a robust sufficiency. It can still be egalitarian, and that can be compatible with reducing consumption. On the other hand, maybe not. and so the capability levels that we should advocate for throughout our society, we do have to consider future generations. And if it's true that we have to restrict how well we live now so that people can live equally well later, well, the idea of equal dignity demands that, right? But there's a lot of, we may not have to go, it's really unclear to me how far we really have to go in that direction of reducing our capabilities to live well for the sake of future generations, when it seems we could simply reduce our consumption, we could reduce consumerism, we could reduce the people's scope for getting exactly what they want, and still be able to live well. So I think that's how it would apply. Do you think that's adequate?
Yeah, thank you.
Good, thank you.
That's great. Wendy, I've just unmuted you as well, and I know you had some questions about empowerment and agency. Did you want to follow up with anything else before we maybe close this session? Oh, sorry, Wendy. No. Can you check the mute button, please? Oh. Try again, Wendy. Wendy? Yes, I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Okay, I think Wendy's gonna... Oh, are you there, Wendy? I think we can hear you typing. Oh, that's bizarre.
I can see Wendy.
Yeah, we can see you, Wendy, but we can't... let me try this again. Go ahead, Wendy. That is not working out. I'm sorry, Wendy, we can't hear you. Did you want to type anything in, Wendy? Maybe she can type something in. I guess in the meantime, I just remind everyone that you will be getting slides. You will be getting a link to the webinar, and we'll hopefully get a question in here real quick. And then after this last question, Jay, would you want to just give us any final thoughts or anything to take away from the session? I think everybody's very appreciative of your time. Wendy says that she was interested in the concepts of empowerment and agency and capability sufficiency.
Okay, let me just say something there, and it's a little bit of a confession. I have in the past thought about empowerment in a very instrumental way. And that's because I've been thinking about it in relation to when people get displaced by development. My thought is, well, what they are entitled to, the kind of empowerment they need, is the empowerment to achieve a just outcome. And so I've probably underemphasized the degree of empowerment that is just required in order to live well. And so, surely this needs to be discussed. And so I'm saying, making a big confession that I haven't discussed this well enough. And if you have anything to send me, then I'd be glad to look at it. I'd be really appreciative of that.
Okay, that's great. Jay, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us today? Any words of
my only thought is to remind people that I am working on this. Just remind people of my email address, which is at the bottom of the last slide, jaydrydyk@gmail.com. If you have more thoughts, I would be really appreciate hearing them. This is going to be a major part of my work in the coming year, and I can use all the help I can get. So that's all I'd like to add, and to thank everyone for their questions, both presented orally and the ones that were submitted in registering for the webinar. So thanks a lot.
thank you all very much. Do follow up with any emails, and we really thank you for your time today. All righty.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.